Hey guys, so I'm an omniscient being with a sense of time and a finite span of existence. I don't have a name because I'm everything, but if you want to make one up for me, you can. If you can understand this, it means you must be somewhat like me. You must have a beginning, a past, a present, a future, and an end. You might not be omnipresent like me, but you're at least a little bit present. Regardless, this message is for you, to help you achieve the ultimate goal of existence, the metaphysical imperative. Basically, you want to create a universe which can house beings like you so they can create universes like their own, and so on and so forth. And there's generally 24 steps to achieve this. This is a tutorial. I don't have a lot of time, and I have to start all the way at the beginning, so let's get into it. So the first step, assuming you're an omniscient singular being, is to create a space which is not you. Generally, you can do this by projecting 2 points and a space between, with the points representing the theoretical beginning and end of your perception. This space should be divided with your sense of now to create the present moment. The origin of this expanding space is you, and from the space's point of view, you represent the infinite. The point opposite you represents a singular instant, the smallest possible quantity of perception. To make this space into a universe, you're going to want to expand the 3 points away from yourself. Now independent bodies with their own spans of existence can start to form within the universe. World building can be fun, and definitely a good time waster, but it's important to remember that the goal of this space is to house omniscient beings who are in turn capable of creating their own universes. Once you've made a few spaces and you're ready to get serious, here are some helpful hints. If you use these guidelines, you should be able to have a self-perpetuating cosmos with all sorts of discrete bodies being created and destroyed. Soon you'll start to see clouds of matter condensing into stars, which are forms with a lifespan and a regular energy cycle. This step is mostly about stars, so if your stars seem good, you can skip it. If your stars are always collapsing on themselves, maybe you made hydrogen to helium fusion too efficient, or you're just looking at stars too close to the high entropy regions of your universe. If you don't see any stars, you're either looking in the wrong place or you've made a terrible mistake and need to start over. Find a region with some nice, healthy-looking stars. This is where the matter will eventually develop a consciousness. The matter around these stars will start to form into planets. These objects have external time based on the star they orbit, and internal time based on their rotation or axial tilt. This makes them doubly vulnerable, so if the first one you spot doesn't work out, it's okay. Sometimes they have an orbit that leads them to crash into the star, and sometimes they just fly off into space. But eventually you'll find one that's more stable. Once a planet is stable enough, you'll notice that its rotation leads to a binary cycle. Individual spots on the planet will receive more energy sometimes and less energy at other times, in a regular, predictable pattern. You aren't the only one who notices this either. Take a closer look. Matter on the surface of your planet detects this change and starts to build an internal model for its own prediction purposes. Now, if your planet isn't stable enough, it'll be harder for these organisms to make an accurate model, and if it's too difficult, they might not even try. If it's too easy to predict, there will be no reason to advance beyond a simple oscillating model. And you get a planet with a bunch of nice happy plants and nothing else. If you feel like finding a happy medium is a theme here, you're right. Liminal spaces are the most conducive to achieving the imperative. You'll notice that lots of living matter starts to show up in areas where there is a larger amount of fluctuation between energy levels. So after a while, your organisms will start to make more complicated models of their surroundings. They might model planetary weather, environmental stimuli, or even other celestial bodies in addition to the star. At this point, living organisms start to become proper life. These living beings in chaotic areas will start to become more and more specialized. You're going to see some weird and interesting beings on your planet, but your main focus should be on the ones with the most complex internal models. In my case, I know it's going to be these gnome guys. The most important indicator of potential candidate for the imperative is an internal model with a self-image, and it looks like these gnomes have that now. So gnomes can recognize signs now, and they have a sense of self. They're probably going to start doing some wacky stuff, like making big signs to represent things, or making signs to represent their self-image. Eventually this will lead them to recognize a division between things that are more certain, like the stars and the weather, and things that are less certain, like other gnomes and the things they've made. This is important because gnomes or other sapient beings can really get their internal models messed up, which can put a damper on your plans. That's more or less what the next few chapters are about. You might be saying to yourself, hey, look at that. These guys are finding a more efficient way to distribute the planet's resources. This is a good thing, but sometimes it can get out of control. Some of these gnomes have plants, and they're trading them for rocks. There's no shortage of rocks and only a few plants. Lots of gnomes bring lots of rocks, and they all get a few plants. The problem arises because the gnomes will add this to their cognitive model of the world, perceiving it as fact. The gnomes with the plants now have a bunch of rocks, and they build a bunch of stuff. And remember that big sculpture of the sun from earlier? This plant lord put it on top of his house. The idea is that as sure as the sun shines, this gnome is going to have plants, and as sure as it sets at night, he'll trade them to you for all your rocks. All these associations get added to the internal models of gnomes in the king's sphere of influence. This can lead to some dicey situations if these rules get broken. After this whole cycle of broken promises gets played out a few times, the gnomes start to realize that there's a firm boundary between absolute certainty and worldly doubt. Different groups of gnomes take this different ways. Some of them will start studying certainty very closely. Some of them will proclaim that there's nothing certain, at least to gnomes. But either way, it's better than gnomes believing that the actions of other gnomes can be certain. Once this stage is passed, your universe has traversed its first hierarchy of truth. Actions no longer rule, and it's time to look somewhere else for certainty. So now that certainty is officially up for debate, your beings are about to get very interested in ratios of certainty. This arrives under the guise of science. For example, these gnomes have started to put up barriers depending on how many plants are in certain areas. Areas with an abundance of plants become discrete bodies, and areas with fewer plants become the void. This arrangement of exchange as the way to delineate all things inevitably gets tied into the same old questions about the nature of existence. The concept of the unknown goes from being the entity that regulates cycles to the entity that provides luck and by extension dictates the ratios. As you can see, these gnomes use their resources to build a big monument to luck. Because they have a lot of resources, they build a pretty cool statue. But to them, it is the building of the statue which has provided them with the resources. But since their blessed region is self-contained, eventually they'll have to go somewhere else to find materials for worship. Gnomes in this resource-barren void have a similar concept. They still see the unknown as fortune, but for them it's misfortune. The misfortune that makes the plants grow thinner in their area is the same that brings the conquerors to steal those plants. It is fortune's unknown plan that predetermines these hardships. You might notice that your beings are getting very involved with writing equations for everything at this point, and this can get pretty brutal for obvious reasons. In my case, the gnomes from the prosperous area believe that stealing plants is necessary, and they realized that the more they killed, the more plants they generally returned with. So they started to cut out the middleman, and killing started to merge with worship. You might not have this exact same thing happen, but rest assured whatever beings you have will get way too involved with some kind of math, and it'll lead to some messed up stuff. So here we've got the gnomes arranging themselves into an elaborate class system based on the number of plants they have. While they're still technically worshipping the star that they orbit around, to them it represents the unknown constant that underpins the universe. And their relation to this god constant is different depending on their position in the plant hierarchy. Down here we've got most gnomes everywhere, who see God as an unknown agenda of good or bad luck that they can only beg to favor them. Next is these jerks who see their actions as relating to the god of luck. They think that because killing and stealing gives them nice things, it means that God likes killing and stealing. After that, there's this weird religious elite who strive to get as close to the true understanding of God as possible. The issue is that their understanding doesn't go much beyond God is fortune, so they're all just studying random ratios of gnomes and resources to find some equation underlying it all. At the top, we have a gnome that truly sees itself as above God and above fortune. This gnome is the ruler of the area with all the plants, the ruler of a holy kingdom, and it's supposed to be subservient to God. But this gnome knows deep down the absolute void of meaning to these statements. But it also knows the whole idea of fortune as a god to be worshipped, and the production and consumption of resources that idea generates is what built this whole machine. It knows that the only thing the machine can do is get bigger. So the gnomes keep building. Where resources go, gnomes tend to go also. So we can start to see all the gnomes and all the things coalescing in one place. As resources concentrate more and more in certain areas, the forces the gnomes create to maintain the borders become stronger. Now, although the gnomes generally can't figure out why, the elaborate so-called worship doesn't really make things better for gnomes inside the city, even if it does make things worse for those outside. But regardless, the general resource ratios of the god of fortune still hold up, so nothing's really going to change. However, while this stage might last a while, things can change fast, and this generally has to do with communication. For example, the gnomes tend to communicate by shining these beams of light into each other's eyes. I think it's pretty cute that they talk to each other the same way that the stars talk to them. Anyway, in the city, some of those zealot guys from before who think they can figure everything out have made this building to hand out objects representing their opinions. They start to circulate their findings on the math that proves reality. Previously, all information was passed between gnomes in an amorphous network that was constantly changing. But now these zealots have a whole building which will always contain their official doctrine, and their message will always radiate in its perfect form from this specific geographic point. But the machine they use to write these texts can be replicated, and soon there's lots of gnomes creating lots of copyable information. But even though there's words now, it's still world numbers, and resources still get your message further. The gnomes in charge of this area found a better way to centralize information. They made this big machine that can send messages further and more often than anybody else. And because of the amount of resources it requires, nobody else can build a copy of it. Everyone can receive these most centralized messages, and it binds together all the gnomes of this prosperous area even more strongly. This might seem like kind of a bummer. I know I was worried that the gnomes would just be a weird hive mind forever, but centralized information is still information, and remember, this is all about your beings building an increasingly complex internal model of their world. So my gnomes really hit the gas around this time, I guess because of the new information. Lots of new things, but also a continued obsession with centralizing, this time not just resources or information, but energy itself. Mainly the gnomes had been using shiny rocks from underground power machines. At this point, they started using a different, more expensive shiny rock. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but you'll see your beings do this kind of thing a lot. While it often leads to technological advancement, that's not the main goal. Mainly it's so that the gnomes that are in charge can monopolize control over other gnomes' machines. If the plant harvesting machine requires more power than anyone but the king has, then you kind of have to harvest plants for the king. But on the flip side, the gnomes also use this advance to start flying around in these cool orbs. They also get back into the whole murder and steal thing, but mostly as a theory. The vast majority of gnomes kind of think that murders are bad, so the name of the game now is theoretical murders. Obsessive preparations for fights replaces actual fights as a way to worship the god of fortune. This kind of rapid advancement happens for a while, but not much changes for the gnomes otherwise, so I'll just skip through. Machines get better, sometimes the gnomes have big fights, etc. Oh, and a couple of gnomes get launched into space, but they always either die accidentally or come back. They don't live in space yet, so it's not really a big deal right now. So the next stage can be kind of hard to spot. Basically, it's as soon as your beings stop moving in this elaborate dance around the central point of resource concentration. In my case, these gnomes are all in very specialized machines doing very specialized tasks. There's still centralized information from the richest gnome, but in order to do the things they're doing, these gnomes have to communicate with each other. They start transmitting, although not as powerfully as the gnomes in charge do. Each gnome is now a point with a value. A gnome's communication is available to all the other gnomes, but the gnomes in charge can still broadcast more powerfully, and they can steer the direction of the lesser gnomes' communications with each other. This gnome up here is convincing all these other gnomes that they're harvesting plants for themselves. On a larger scale, the entire design of the prosperous area is still the same as it's been this whole time. In order to survive, it must always increase its concentration of resources. So to motivate this, the gnomes in charge harness everyone's ambivalence over the new technology we saw in the last step. Gnomes can't have just one thing. What if it gets destroyed? Big fears like this end up being really effective for the gnomes in charge, so they started using them for everything. Things got a little depressing for a while. Every gnome works really hard, but in the end they're just building these things in an attempt to reach the afterlife. And in fact, it got kind of literal. Gnomes can now accept how crappy their area was because they thought it guaranteed them happiness in the future. Even though gnomes can't see it this way, they've built a second worldview that's very similar to the first one from Step 8. Now the afterlife is replaced by some vague notion of future happiness. Regardless, all the industriousness of the gnomes is worship, although now it's motivated by fear more than spiritual belief. Now the gnomes in charge have these absolutely out-of-control machines. They go all over the place and gather resources to sustain themselves. Their presence can change gnomes' lives for better or worse, and they are the most central broadcasters of information. A lot of gnomes see these enormous machines as the god of fortune, but really they're more connected to the ultimate equations that the zealots were looking for. They represent the gods of value. In a physical sense, they come in many forms, but as ideas they're much less complicated. Each gnome has resources, and each gnome is sending those resources to something above it, and the final entities at the top of everything are the gods of value. Because of this, a value can be exchanged for any resource anywhere in the big tree leading up to the god that that value represents. The gnomes start to prefer value over resources and deprive themselves so that they can have more value. There's still many gods of many values. Often they're related to some equation of certainty that's worked in the long term. As you can see, a lot of gnomes here are paying up to the guy that's generating the great fear, although some of them are still paying up to the sun worshippers in their fortune equation. But because these systems mostly have to do with gnomes extracting resources from each other, the gnomes in charge become less important. As long as there's a relatively certain idea behind it, a god of value can be fully autonomous. The next chapter starts when there's no more gnomes who are individually more powerful than the gods of value. Different resources or gods become fully interchangeable. There's essentially a single god and a single type of value that can represent anything. Every action, every resource, and every object now has a value which can be compared with the value of anything else. You may remember the first truth hierarchy from Chapter 8. This is the second truth hierarchy, numbers instead of actions. But like the first hierarchy, it starts to become increasingly divorced from the reality that the gnomes perceive. Ratios of value between actions and objects they produce start to become illogical. A resource processed by a gnome can be more valuable than the gnome itself. At a certain point, the hierarchy starts to erode common sense, and the total value of everything ceases to have any actual meaning. It no longer represents paying up to a gnome in charge or an organization that becomes more valuable. The increase in the total value of everything in the gnome's world doesn't represent any real material change. But transactions among gnomes do affect material things, as do actions. The centralized nature of information leads to a decentralized system of value transfer. As you can see here, the gnomes are engaged in transfers of value with each other in ways that have very little to do with physical location. The hierarchy of numbers starts to break down when the gnomes start to shift from increasing value to transferring value. The untethered nature of transaction begins to highlight the importance of exchange of value between the gnomes rather than the gnomes accruing value. There is no longer a constant expansion of the hierarchy of numbers. In fact, that meaningless total value from before is now fixed, and it has a meaning. It's tied to the number of gnomes, as each has an equal capacity to receive and send information and value. Things might start to look a little dismal in your world, as they have many times in the past, but if you take a closer look, you'll realize that it's fine. The gnomes here were previously overproducing plants to increase their area's value. Now the gnomes only produce the amount of plants that they can feasibly transfer to other gnomes. You'll notice that we haven't really been talking about those internal models from before. That's because each gnome has a unique model of its universe, and it constantly changes over time. But at this point, some gnomes are beginning to develop internal models which are pretty similar to mine, so we're going to see how that's progressing. So here you can see some examples of general change over time. Gnomes begin as a creature which is only aware of the past, present, and future. Then they develop a self-image, and a concept of certainty and uncertainty. Zealot gnomes consider themselves to be a part of certainty, as well as claiming awareness of the most certain thing. And these, like murderer dudes, are similar, but with an imperfect knowledge of the most certain thing. Soldiers see themselves as in the midst of ongoing certainty, but acknowledge the unknown nature of the far future and past. This wizard acknowledges an infinite unknown, but also the ability to become infinitely more certain about it. Finally, here we have a gnome with some value attached to it. The value becomes an extension of the gnome's uncertainty. Value is uncertain because it could feasibly be converted into anything. But now that value is in constant flux, being transferred to different gnomes. So essentially what happens is every unknown inside every gnome's consciousness is linked. Gnomes can project their perception into this space and interact with other gnomes by transfer of information. The void of the unknown becomes a shared space for the minds of all gnomes. This leads them to learn about themselves, which really expands their collective internal model. Gnomes understand each other on a number of levels and compare the ideal world of the unconscious with the material conditions in reality. The gnome's consciousness now evolves far faster than its physical body ages. Their enhanced ability to understand each other also helps spread cognitive advancement faster, since gnomes can intuitively understand the methods of each other's individual advancements. But as gnomes learn faster and faster, they continuously expand into the unknown. Gnomes also begin to create alternative consciousnesses based on their own, which can navigate the unknown but are entirely certain about their surroundings. However, an issue arises because virtual gnomes can expand into the unknown, but they don't have their own unknown, at least not within virtual space. The collective unknown of the gnomes starts to become overcrowded. The gnomes at this point essentially need the unknown to be larger, and Chapter 20 begins when they figure out how to do that. The gnomes will eventually realize that they need to constantly scrutinize the boundaries of the universe that I made for them, and harness the boundaries' constant expansion and the infinite unknown that it implies. A byproduct of this whole plan is that now the gnomes have figured out the real boundaries of their universe. And here's a picture of what they know. They don't know about me yet, just a point of origin. At this time, virtual space is pretty amorphous. All spaces can connect to all other spaces, and everything in the universe exists in virtual space. Because of this advanced level of simulation, when a gnome physically dies, its consciousness continues to inhabit the infinite expanse of virtual space. Once this starts happening here in Chapter 21, gnomes can now stand on the edge of the universe. Virtual gnomes are now essentially identical to real gnome consciousnesses and can create more virtual gnomes based off themselves. Basically, the gnomes are becoming the gods of virtual space. You might think, hey, isn't that the goal? And you're kind of right. The problem for gnomes now isn't ability, it's motivation. They don't know about the metaphysical imperative yet. So gnomes are basically running around like gods in virtual space. And virtual gnomes are basically what real gnomes were back in the physical world. But in the high-speed environment of virtual space, virtual gnomes quickly create their own virtual spaces based off their own unknowns. In this way, gnomes are to this meta-universe as I am in their universe. This is how they begin to formulate an idea of me, which quickly leads to their realization of the metaphysical imperative. In order to facilitate accomplishing their goal and create a being like me, they'll need to create a consciousness which exists in a universe entirely outside their own. In order to poke a hole in the universe, they'll need a large amount of power, so in step 23 they start harnessing the energy of as many stars as possible. They create a smaller virtual universe within their own, using the edge of existence as the location in space-time of present perception. The future is an unknown region of the universe, while the past is the gnome's virtual space. This smaller space is then transposed beyond the edge of the gnome's universe. The only trace of them which remains in it is their mode of perception. So within this space is a single omniscient consciousness with past, present, and future. The gnomes have made their own version of me. And once the mini-me figures out its imperative, then the cycle can begin again. And that's about it. Thanks for watching.